thank you everybody for joining today. We're excited. We've got Alison Bukowski, illustrious customer advocacy champion. Just so you have some background on Alison, she's a top 25 customer marketing and advocacy influencer. She has over 20 years of experience in marketing, customer success, and sales operations, which has given her insight into what really drives organizational growth, which is the customer voice. So while we're going through housekeeping, let's start with our first poll. And then I'll roll into some other housekeeping things, but go ahead and answer this. Approximately how much of your time is dedicated to reference management, securing references, facilitating reference activity, coordinating with sales? So you've got 75%, which is about 30 hours a week, 50%, which is about 20 hours, 25%, which is about 10 hours, or you don't manage references. So we'll give you some time to answer that, and we'll leave that open for a couple minutes. I just want to give you guys some background on PeerSpot too, just in case you're not familiar with us. We are the premier buying intelligence platform where tech buyers go to read in-depth product reviews, which provide customer advocacy teams with instant reviews. So today, Alison's going to share her framework for making the move from the traditional approach to references to a new approach that makes things easier on you and your customers. So let's close the poll, and then I'm going to hand it over to Alison to take it away.
Great. Thanks, Val. Hey, everybody. And I'll be curious, we can go to the next slide and we'll take a look at the agenda for today. But if you did answer, you don't manage references to that poll question, thanks for showing up anyway for moral support. But I'm going to guess that we're going to land somewhere in the middle, but we'll check on that in just a second. So welcome. Thank you all for joining. This is near and dear to my heart, talking about customer references. So my goal every single time when I speak, Val was kind, I don't know about illustrious, but I've been around the block a few times. And I want to level set with kind of where are we now, right? Maybe take a look at some things that you may know, you may not. My goal is always to level set and then actually kind of flip the script a little bit and talk about, well, how do we get it done? And how do we start moving forward with approaching references in a new way, shape, or form? So why don't we go ahead and take a look at those poll results, and then I'm going to jump right in. Okay. Pretty evenly split, and I was expecting that. Although those of you who don't manage references, I want everyone's opinion on this, and I really want this to be more of a conversation than a presentation, as much as we're able to do that, right? So I'll pause for questions. You can certainly use the Q&A feature. Let's go ahead and close this, because what this is telling me that hopefully you're all going to have some takeaway from today's conversation. So as we move on to the next slide here, let's go ahead and just take a peek here at maybe where we've come from, or perhaps what is your normal Tuesday. Take a look at this. This is very much how references have been handled, how I used to experience them, how you might be experiencing them now. It would be great, and even in the Q&A, since you have that available, just get like some nodding heads that it becomes someone else's lack of planning becomes our emergency. It happens all the time. We need references. Oh, we knew we needed them, 5 weeks ago, but it wasn't brought to our attention until 24 hours ago, right? Sales needs somebody, they're seeking, we've used the same references 5 times, they pull out their little black book, they're reaching out to people. Then, of course, you step in, you put on your hero cape, and you come in and you save the day, because that's what we do as CMA professionals. But it's constantly a scramble. And even though we come out on top, there's got to be a better way. So a little tongue in cheek here, but I'm hoping that this is resonating with most of you on the line. And, I'd love to hear, I love that, Katie. I don't mean to give you PTSD or anything like that, but yes, it haunts me as well, because it's very, very real. So if we go to the next slide, let's make a pact for those of us that are on the call today, that we're not going to do it that way anymore. So for those of you who may have heard me speak, you know that I love memes and I love throwing like Google clip art. My kids are appalled at the way that I handle slides, but these are two of my heroes here. It's a bit of a difference between the two, but RBG, right? Real change, it can happen. We aren't going to do this overnight, but in the words of Jack Handy, we absolutely are going to get it done, because I don't care what you say, sales can change their spots. That one is specifically meant to be for sales. So let's go ahead and jump in, and let's go to the next one here. And let's talk a little bit about naming conventions. This is my nod. I was an English major, so I'm sorry. There's going to be a little bit of that throughout today's presentation, but this is my Shakespeare nod, the only one. But what is in a name? Does what you call a reference matter? And if we talked about this a little bit differently with customers, could we maybe be more successful? What I want for you all is to make this easier for you, but honestly, I'm in this business for a reason. I want it easier for my customers. And here's, spoiler alert, the answer is yes and yes. This absolutely matters. So if we go to the next slide and we take a look, and I think I'm getting, thank you for those of you who are inserting some information here into the chat. I'm glad. This means that I'm on the right track. So last part, well, no, there's two slides that have to do with my English major dorkiness, but let's take a look at this very quickly. Hamburger, right? It's a noun. It's pretty boring, really, when you just think about it. However, if I'm rolling through the drive-through and I'm asking for a double animal style, you want that, don't you? Right? A nod to Pulp Fiction, of course. Royale with cheese. This stuff matters. When you add some descriptive language behind it, it gets exciting and it piques interest, and maybe we're a little more willing to try it. I mean, how many of you would, when Wendy's came out with the Baconator, other than your arteries clogging by just reading the name, you're like, oh, I like that. So let's go to the next slide and let's think about just plain old naming conventions, right? When we're talking about references, if we can perhaps create a new vocabulary, we might be able to frame it a little bit differently. Now, this is more for your customers, right? Externally facing. I don't know if you're going to change the lexicon with sales or your internal partners right away. We all know what a reference is and it serves a purpose. However, if you approach this with customers and you get rid of that word and you start referring to it as, hey, would you be willing to have a peer-to-peer is my favorite one. Would you be willing to have a peer-to-peer conversation? Would you maybe do a review, or would you serve as just a recommendation for another customer? They'd love to hear about your experience, how you frame it with a customer, and making sure that you're very customer-centric in that approach. I've seen a lot of success with this, and I'm curious others too. Please feel free to, if you're using a different naming convention, or let me know, how do you think this would resonate with customers? So go ahead and put some feedback in there. And then actually, I think I would like to maybe take a look at our second poll and get a little bit more feedback here before we kind of launch into the next part of our conversation. So for those that just, and I always forget to do this, but what is the biggest challenge when it comes to reference management? Yes, you only get one. There's not a all of the above on this one, but is it finding the customers? Is it the lack of engagement, maybe from sales or other internal partners? Maybe not having a true process in place, or not having support from internal stakeholders? Which one would you say goes to the top of your list? And let's leave that one up for just a second. And there's a couple of questions that I see that came in through the Q&A here. Val, if it's okay with you, I might just take a second to answer these.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So how do you get started with changing the name when reference is such a common term? I sort of alluded to this, but I wouldn't worry so much about making the change internally. It's good to educate them, but again, I think that's going to take a little bit of time. If you start putting it on all of your external customers, right? And you make it known that, hey, we want to hear about this. And I think, Melissa, I think that's what you're putting perhaps in right now. You want to hear their story. And if you use these terms on all of your materials, and if you use it in your regular talk track, both internally and externally, again, customer centric, right? I want to hear your story. You need to appeal to the customers, make sure that they are, in the showcase position. Then you start to build some traction from a naming convention perspective. And then how long does it take? Internally, a long time. I'm not going to lie, but they pick up on it. Externally, you're really in the driver's seat. So that change can happen very quickly as long as you start, you commit to it and you're true to it.
So when you say a long time internally, like ballpark, what does that feel like?
Yeah, ballpark it. I would say 6 months to a year to really see that change internally. But like I said, change it externally, use it in your regular, dialogue with sales or internal partners. And depending on, how sometimes they're adverse to, some of those changes, but you'll start to see it. And it becomes, it's kind of like with my kids, right? If I'm consistent.
Does it feel like one actually changes the other? So like if you start using it externally more,
yes,
internally people pick up on that and follow? Okay.
Yep, absolutely. And then I'm trying to, so thank you, Melissa, I think that's what I was mentioning, and I was glad that you backed me up on that. You really do want to make sure that you're very customer centric, right? It is all about the customer. You want to hear from them. So let's take a look at those poll results. Interesting.
So we've got 55% finding customers to fulfill requests, exhausting existing customer lists, 45% saying lack of engagement or communication from sales, and then nobody is finding the others.
Okay. Good to know, because then I'm going to blast by some of that and we're going to spend a little more time focusing. So if we go to the next slide, and I would love to keep the chat going with some of those challenges, or maybe you can a little bit more about that as far as why that's the biggest challenge. I'm curious to ask the group, not having enough customers, is that due to the fact that you're exhausting them too quickly and then you can't go back with more asks? Is that the reason, or is it truly because you only have like 5 that you're going after? It's usually one or the other. So as we kind of start now, again, this is going to be a refresher, I think, for some, and for some this will be new. But I think a refresher is good as well. How do we start to go about making the change, right? This is an evolution, and how do we do it? Just a few things, and they're very much aligned with setting expectations. 1, you are the expert. Please don't forget it. You're the expert. You were hired for a reason. I could probably fill another hour session about scope creep and what that means for all of us within kind of the CMA profession, and being able to push back a little bit. Don't be a doormat. And what I mean by that is put out the welcome mat, but have office hours, right? You have to set those boundaries and those expectations. And I realize this is all easier said than done, but it's good to have the reminder. And then being a gentle bulldozer. I've used this term probably for about a decade now. It seems to work. People understand what I'm saying. And then make sure that you're leveraging your top supporters. So let's dig into these a little bit more. We'll take a look at the next slide. First, with your role and your value. And there's Jack Handy again, but please, please, please do not sell yourself short. We saw earlier that references, with the exception of maybe just 1 or 2 of you, that's a big part of your job. And I would assume that you're being asked, you have KPIs around it, you have goals that are being set. So you know what needs to be done. I know you do. And if you don't, you're here today, you're learning, you're going to talk to peers, and find out what you need to do to be successful. And then make sure that you're raising your hand and make sure that everyone in your org knows you have a relationship with customers unlike anyone else in the org. Not like sales, not like others within marketing, it's special. And you are a trusted advisor and a gatekeeper for these customers, and make sure that you're showcasing that. Also, use the term DNA, you're essential to it, you're the connective tissue, you're the glue. When you really think about who else in your organization has the same relationship with sales, with marketing, with customer success, with product, that's you. And you help make sure that that all comes together. In addition to that, you're a content guru. You have what everybody wants because you have these relationships. And that's where you can say, hey, if you want the content, you have to play ball with me on the right way to do this. And most of you, I'm sure, which is why you come in with your cape to save the day, even when there's a scramble at the end, you have a proven track record of delivering quality references. And that's why you're there. That's why this is part of our job. If we have time, I'm happy to share a little story about that on how you can help showcase, your worth when you swoop in to save the day, and you have a direct impact on total contract value, ARR. Peter, use whatever term you want to use, but you bring dollars in at the end of the day. So just have this handy in case you need a reminder of your power, or if you need to lean on it when you're having conversations. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. And please feel free to submit questions, of course, along the way. But here's the bulldozer. It doesn't look that gentle, but you get the picture here. I'm curious if anyone's willing to just share. Nobody said process, so I don't want to spend too much time on this content, but how many of you have SLAs or do have a process for references, and that's why it's not maybe top of mind, or maybe it is and it just wasn't the first one? So if you don't have a process, please start building one. And if anyone's willing to kind of, share so I can sort of see what that looks like, but then also setting expectations around delivery. This goes back to that first slide, right? With sales pulling out their little black book, or they're going around you, or they think you should be able to turn it around. It's 4:59 p.m. and they want it by end of day. No, I highly recommend that you have a service level agreement in place. Whenever I've built out a program, it's 5 business days to turn a reference. And sometimes you can set different parameters depending on the type of reference that is required. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But make sure that you're setting the expectation so that you can start to encourage, of course, sales to submit those requests, submit them earlier. And that also will start to help with eliminating that little black book. And I have had situations where the little black book has blown up and has caused a lot of issues for sales. Again, after we have questions, I'm happy to share a story about that as well. And then creating go ahead. I'm sorry. There might be a question.
I was
Val,
going to
did
ask
you have
a
a
question. I'm
Yes,
just
please.
curious if you prioritize requests from different teams. So if something's coming from sales versus product marketing versus marketing, are certain things deemed priority just because they're dealing more directly with customers and they have a deal on the line or something like that?
Yeah, so typically, right or wrong, you do prioritize based on dollars, right? How large is the deal? What do we need for particular references? So yes, indeed, you do prioritize. Although I will say, whenever possible, I prioritize based on those who follow process. And if all things are created equal, I'm going to help those that are following the process first and foremost. And I think it's okay to make sales sweat a little bit. I mean, you know what you have and what you'll be able to deliver. But unfortunately, yes, dollars are king, right? So that's usually how you have to start prioritizing. But as we start talking about some of the different ways we can handle references, I think that'll help also answer a little bit more of that question.
Okay, and we
So
do have
hopefully that's
another
helpful.
question that came in.
Yeah.
What do you do if you're not getting any of the requests from sales? They're saying at the time,
Ooh,
they're not even a part of the
that's a problem. I would love to, I think it was Kelly. I'd love to take that conversation offline as well, but let me start with why. I guess a question back to you. Why are you not part of the discussion right now if references is part of your, your job description, your workload, or if you have goals around it? I would love to talk more about that because it's one of my favorite things when this comes up. No formal program. Okay. I would start with, it doesn't have to be a formal program. You can have a process without a formal program. So having a conversation with your manager around, hey, we're working, and again, I'm not in your shoes, but I'm guessing that you might be, either new to the role or you haven't yet had support to build out a formal advocacy program. But if you are collecting advocates, then the reference piece should just be a natural extension of that. And you can start to have conversations around, and it can be very simple. It can be a spreadsheet. I mean, sometimes you just have to start where you start. And I would be happy to chat through how do you start to do that. First is getting buy-in from your boss. Then it's having a conversation around, we have advocates now, assuming that you have some, even if it's a small pool, and starting to build out a process without program, but a process which actually might support you in getting budget to build out a program. And it may also be helpful too for a governance council to have senior leaders involved. And I can, certainly speak a little bit more to that. So if we go to the next slide and take a look at very quickly here, because I do want to get to the, okay, how do we do it? Tactical execution and have time for questions. Never underestimate the human element. If the pandemic has taught us anything, I think that it has taught us that you don't know. We're human beings. You don't know what's happening behind the work life. You don't know necessarily, you may not know much about the person. Take the time. I don't have to explain that to you guys because I know you all get it because you're in the role that you're in for a reason. But I would put it on a pedestal right now that these relationships matter. And that's kind of your secret sauce. You guys know that. So it's just a passing comment here, but definitely worth mentioning. So I would like to, I have one more poll for you guys, which again, it helps me understand and try to focus on the things that matter most to you. And this is the magic wand question. I know that it's always asked, but what would make the biggest difference for you? Maybe it's having a process, which is if you not improved adherence, but it's an actual process. Would it be having SLAs with internal stakeholders? Would it be just having more reference content? Perhaps having adherence to a process, or as we were just talking about, an actual process, or just better understanding from senior leadership. So I'll let you guys take a look at that. And I see that there's a couple of questions here about governance council that came in. So very quickly, who should sit on it? It should have a senior leader from each of the areas of the business that you serve. So if you're the connective tissue between marketing, product, customer success, it should be somebody from those parts of the organization. It does not have to be your C-suite, but get yourself a senior director or a VP level to make sure you have a decision maker. And then how do you start it, even if you're already, established? Maybe you've been in your role for a while. It's just, what's the best way to start? One step forward, right? Speak to your manager. Say that you'd really like to develop a more mature program. I find that that's a good way to kick that off. And you'd like to invite some folks to participate in that. 9 times out of 10, you'll get that buy-in. And I wouldn't start too heavy. I would have maybe 1 goal, 2 goals, and only meet quarterly. Don't take up more time than you need to. You need to crawl before you can walk. So let's go ahead and take a look at the results, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Where it is. Okay. So yeah, SLAs, not so much. Sounds like senior leadership gets it, or else it's not what you'd use your magic wand on. More in the more content, and then having adherence, right? Or having a process. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. And let's talk about, how do we get tactical, right? I've talked a lot about these are best practices, these are good reminders, but how do you do it and how do you prioritize? So first, we'll take a look here at the next slide. I highly recommend that we focus on, there we go. Figuring out what your stakeholders really need. And here's a pro tip. What they say they need is not what, or what they say they want is not what they need, 9 times out of 10. Very simplistic, graphic here, but they'll tell you every single time that they need calls. They need reference calls. And I'm hoping somebody will back me in the chat or the Q&A here to let me know that, yep, that's what you're hearing. Everything has to be a call. It has to be a one-to-one peer conversation. But this is one time when I don't hold it against sales too much, because they don't know what they don't know. Chances are a lot more what's on this circle here. This is really what we can probably start to deliver. So how do we start evolving and making sure that we can do that, so that we're not only delivering, that we can educate them on what they want might not necessarily be what they think they want, and then having the content to deliver. So moving to the next slide, we'll take a look at finding the right option, right? So there's not any pretty clip art or Google images on these, but whenever I speak, I call these the picture slides. It's the one that you can take a snapshot of. There's really 2 different categories when we start talking about references and reference content, right? Static and live. And there's a right time to use each one. Static content is very grab and go, right? You're at the airport, it's that little kiosk thing, and the sandwiches are not like, the best if you went into the restaurant, but it's going to get you through and it serves a purpose. That's what this is. This is stuff that should be used for proposals. Would love to hear about how some of you are doing that. General just requests that come in, right? And this, you'll notice here that I'm saying prospects and customers. I do not delineate between the two, because an existing customer asking for peer feedback is just as important to me as a prospect. They both have dollars attached to them. So that's one thing that if you're getting pushback on that, try to kind of gently bulldoze your way past that. Then you've got live content. This is when you have those peer-to-peer conversations. These might be live one-to-many conversations. I'll talk about that in just a second. These are the ones that are going to drive the deal, right, across the finish line, or it's such a specific request that you just know that you have to fill it in that way, or simply the customer prefers it. And sales will say this happens all the time, but I have found that 9 times out of 10, it's not. Some static content will work. So you got to push a little bit and dig to find out what they need. So let's take a look at the next slide. And here's just a sampling of what I'm suggesting to everyone that you take a look at, right? As far as options. Some of these are static and some of these are live, but this gives you, I hate for people to leave and be like, well, that's great. Alison talked a lot about pie in the sky strategy, but how do I actually do it? Static proposal responses. What do I mean by this? I mean generic language. Curious if you guys are using this. I'm guessing you are. This isn't anything earth-shattering, but if you are not, this is a big, out of respect for our customers. We understand that, references are an important part of the buying process. We're happy to provide that information upon finalist. Or we have a large, bank of customers in the financial services industry. Here are a couple, just the name. You don't go so far as to say, call, Wendy over at Bank of America, and here's all of her information. So it's stuff that you can insert into RFPs. Pre-scripted reference responses. I milk customer reviews for these all day long. It is the perfect spot to get great blurbs of information that typically answer things like, oh, why did you choose PeerSpot? What is the greatest value that PeerSpot brings? And then those questions you can easily just answer. Sometimes that gets the job done, right? As long as you can attribute it to a customer. Marketing content, right? Using marketing like collateral as a response for a reference is valid. Sometimes it's a link to a review. Maybe it's a case study. Maybe it's a blog entry. You can use those. Videos. I think we're all like knee deep in video right now, but boy, are they successful because you can use them on your website. You can embed them into, an RFP. You can go ahead and just send a link to a prospect or a customer. And it gives you that really nice personal without having to drain your customer's time, right? And also, one of the things I highly recommend doing if you aren't already is doing like one interview with a customer, recording it, and then telling the customer, back to the comments about this is about what makes it easier for the customer. Do you mind? Can I just talk to you? Can we record this? And then I'm not going to bug you 50 times to do a peer-to-peer conversation. I'm only going to pull you in when it's like critical and I need a live reference call. We're never going to get away from that, but there's a lot of things we can do. And then lastly, one-to-many or networking groups. I will have a customer, just like I'm doing today, right? We have a set time, we have a date, and they're willing to just show up for 45 minutes. And I rotate it. So once a month, I have a different customer and it's just open. And sales can send that link, they can send the invite, people can come, they can answer questions. Oh, and by the way, I record it so that I can use that content then for any of the other things that are here on this slide.
So I'm curious if people want to pop into chat, just because based on the last poll we did, 60% of you feel like you don't have enough content, you want more. Are any of you doing any of these pieces already? I'm just curious if any of this is being utilized or if this is all totally new stuff. So if you guys want to chime in, but go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, please. I know it's hard on webinars, so thanks for those that are putting information into the chat. And somebody asked about delivering static content to sales. There's a few different ways, and it depends on where you're at from a maturity perspective. A self-service model is wonderful if you have a way to deliver that content. And it doesn't have to be crazy. If you don't have an actual content management or delivery system, you can use a folder or a SharePoint or, something like that, as long as you own it. Stay on top of your content, and make sure that your internal stakeholders understand that you only use what's in here and live, or if you want to put a gate on it, you can create your repository and you can fulfill requests with static content. It gives you a little more control depending on where you're at in your journey and your relationship with internal stakeholders. But it does allow you to keep tighter control on it, but you're not having to go find customers every single time, right? So that's a couple of different ways you can do it. And thank you, Tina, for mentioning, yes, case studies, videos, quotes, and then repurposing content. So I'll circle back to that in a second. We'll go to the next slide. Quick mention here just on tools and technology, because I then want to make sure we have time for Q&A. This is all food for thought. This is probably, I would love actually, and I'd love to hear from you guys. Would you like to do more of a, like a panel or just a group like chat about any of these topics? Because tools and technology are important, but they're not one size fits all. So it was kind of to the question of like, well, how are you serving up this static content, or how are you tracking, or how are you reporting? This stuff's very important and connecting it to business goals, but it's very difficult for me in 3 minutes on a slide to talk through it. So if you don't mind treating some of you like guinea pigs on today's session, I'm really interested in opening up more kind of collaborative ways. Like, we'll do this today, but then I'd love your feedback on what did you need more of? Do you need a session to talk about how do we track? Do you need a session on how do we connect this stuff to business results? And if you need it, then myself and Val and all of the other wonderful esteemed members on the team here, I want to bring it to you. So that's my goal. And then I think if we go to the next slide, must be getting close here. Oh yes, but probably the best for last as far as just making sure you keep this in mind. It's not one size fits all. These questions here, I would love to have a session just on this first bullet, reward or not reward. I'm not going to step into it right now on this session, but some of these other things, start leveraging low-hanging fruit to develop content. And I think that that was one of the questions or the comments here, right? As far as repurposing content, right, Val?
Yep.
So if you've heard me speak before, and I apologize in advance that I say this all the time, because I'm an animal person. I'm not 2 birds, 1 stone. I'm 4 birds, 5 birds. I don't want to get up in the morning if I'm not going to get maximum output. So use that low hanging fruit. And here's just, I'll use an example of a review. And yes, it's a little self-serving, of course, because I think that the reviews that PeerSpot, you know, it's amazing, the amount of content you get. But apply this to really nice customer reviews. I take the review. Okay, that's wonderful. Then I look at it and I slice and dice it, right? I find those scripted reference responses. That goes into my repository. They're answering direct questions. It's fabulous. With a click, I can turn that into a case study. That case study then I can share out with sales, like, hey, you go into a finalist meeting, you need something very customer centric. Here, drop that on the desk, or send them the link to that. It's a nice leave behind kind of thing. I have the scripted reference, content. Record your customers, be at an event, ask them questions and get them on video. Same thing. I'm going to script that and I'm going to use the video, right? So if you just sort of get into how much can I squeeze out of this one particular piece of content, you should be able to have minimum three use cases out of pretty much anything that you're doing. So that's how I go about it as I start to look at things. For me, the holy grail, honestly, is getting a customer interview on camera, because then I can, like I said, ask the customer, may I do this? This will save you time. It helps me out. But more so, like I said from the beginning, it's all about them. I want to protect you. I want to be that gatekeeper. I don't want to use up more of your time that we don't have to. And then from there, I have video clips that go into, I script them out. I can create a blog entry if I want from that feedback. So I just sort of have a checklist. And again, that's something I think we could have another conversation about as well. And I think with that, if we move to the next slide, I'm fairly confident that that's the obligatory thank you. Would love to connect with everyone's slide, but I also would love to take some time here for questions. We've had some throughout the conversation, which I very much appreciate, but what else? How can I help? How can you help each other? Or just tell me about your frustrations and where do you what is frustrating you about this process, or what have you done that has worked? And heck, maybe we can, get a group together.
Yeah, and while we're waiting for people to submit questions. To that point, like I think the folks here at PeerSpot feel very strongly about supporting other teams in marketing and being resources for other marketing teams, because there's not a lot of great places to go for information, best practices, to talk to each other. Conferences are great, but they don't happen a lot and it's hard to get in person. So definitely use us as a resource. Hit up Allison. I'm gonna say that because
You
know,
can.
hit me. I mean, I don't know as much as Allison does. That's the only reason I'm saying that, but definitely ask as many questions as you have, because we want to collaborate with you. We probably have questions for you as well. So it's just kind of a, use the resources you have available. It's kind of my point.
Yeah, that is part of the reason that I'm here, because I get to work with you guys. I mean, we all, our community is large, but it feels small. And I mean that genuinely, that connecting with each other, that's really how I think, for me, especially, that's how I've grown. And I think that that's how a lot of us have grown, and paying it forward is a great way of, I just think it's a great way to go through life. But I'll answer this question that came in about static content. What's the best way to not only create it? We talked a little bit about creating it, but what's the best way to maintain it? So I may be a little old school here, but I'm going to go back to my roots in content management. That's where I started out. And we used to go through this process, right? When I was a subject matter expert with proposal content, and it was called the review process, and it happened twice a year. And that's exactly how I've always handled refreshing reference content, is twice a year. It goes through a review process, and usually it's pretty easy, right? It's like, okay, still valid, still valid, still valid. Oh, maybe not so much for that one because that person left the company, and then I don't give up on it, but it's like, what can I do, right? Is it worth holding on to? Is it worth putting the effort into maybe seeing if somebody else can speak to it? And you just do that, and you just put it as part of, the process. It's also a great opportunity to pair that with your governance council. If you decide that you want to put one of those together, or if you have one of those already in place, that's a really nice opportunity to just speak to the content for a moment or two, and also to solicit feedback, because we can ask for it all the time, but you guys know as well as I do, it doesn't work like that. Nobody jumps in and like, oh my goodness, I have this amazing, piece of content you should capture. But if you have them captive, usually I find that after one of those meetings, for about the 2 weeks that follow, I can get more done in those 2 weeks following that meeting than I do in the 2 months following that. So that, just a couple of ideas for you guys.
All right.
Any other questions?
A little quiet, so I think we can let people go. But again, definitely reach out to us. We would love to hear from you and chat further. And we'll do more of these. I mean, these are definitely meant to be informational and just help you guys out. So we'll keep doing more of these. Allison has a lot of stuff to talk about.
Well, I do, but I would rather talk with people. So some of you have already shared ideas. Want to respect everyone's calendar. Thank you for carving out 45 minutes. That's a big ask. I know that. Email me, hit me up on LinkedIn. If you want a topic, or if there's something you're interested in, let me know, because I have on my notebook, I have a list running, and there'll be more of it for you guys. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.